Welcome to Friends and Fiction. 4 New York Times bestselling authors, endless stories. Novelists Mary Kay Andrews, Kristin Harmel, Kristy Woodson Harvey, and Patti Callahan Henry are 4 longtime friends with more than 70 published books between them. Together, they host Friends and Fiction, with author interviews and fascinating insider talk about publishing and writing, to highlight and support independent bookstores. They discuss the books they've written, the books they're reading now, and the art of storytelling. If you love books and you're curious about the writing world, you're in the right place.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Friends and Fiction Show. I'm Ron Block.
And I'm Kristin Harmel.
And this is Friends and Fiction, 4 New York Times bestselling authors, endless stories to support indie bookstores, authors, and librarians.
If you're not with us already, we hope you'll join our Facebook group, which is more than 250,000 members strong. We would also like to invite you to follow us on Instagram and YouTube, and to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, which is full of awesome bonus content. We'll tell you a little bit more about that later. You can find out more about our community and all we have to offer at friendsandfiction.com.
Awesome. We also want to remind you about the Friends and Fiction 2025 book subscription box, available only through our friends at the independent bookstore Oxford Exchange, which we love. Mm-hmm. For one all-in price, you'll get 3 separate shipments in 2025. The first one with Patti's new book, The Story She Left Behind, is available now, and then you'll get packages in May with Kristy's Beach House Rules, and in June with Kristin's new book, The Stolen Life of Colette Marceau. All of them signed, all of them hardcover first editions. Plus, you'll get a Friends and Fiction friendship bracelet and a Friends and Fiction car magnet that are available only in this bundle. Visit friendsandfiction.com and click on merch to find out more. Okay, on this episode, we are thrilled, that's putting it mildly, to welcome Emma Donoghue to discuss her new novel, The Paris Express, which was just released on March 18th. Okay, let's give you a little bit of a background on Emma first before we bring her on. She was born in Dublin in 1969. She's the writer of contemporary and historical fiction whose novels include the international bestseller Room, Frog Music, Slammerkin, The Sealed Letter, Landing, Life Mask, Hood, and Stir Fry. Her story collections are Astray, The Woman Who Gave Birth to Rabbits, Kissing the Witch, and Touchy Subjects. Her fiction has been translated into more than 40 languages, and her screen adaptation for Room, starring Brie Larson, was nominated for 4 Oscars, amazing. Of which Brie won. Brie won Best Actor.
Amazing.
I know. She also writes literary history and plays for stage and radio. She lives in London, Ontario, with her partner and their 2 children. Her new novel, The Paris Express, was just released on March 18th. And it's a sweeping historical novel about an infamous 1895 disaster at the Paris, I'm going to get this wrong, Montparnasse train station. And I know Kristin and I have been texting back and forth how much we love it, so we can't wait for this. Alan, can you bring Emma on?
Hello, friends of fiction.
Hello, Emma.
So good to see you.
And yes. I say what a pleasure it is to be interviewed by novelists and librarians, you know?
Oh, feels like
more of a family potluck of literature than, stealing myself to meet the enemy.
I love it. No, this is a super friendly place.
Yes, great team too. Okay, Emma, welcome to the Friends and Fiction Show. The Paris Express, start right out with that, is a retelling of a railway disaster captured in compelling photographs. What was it about this event that sparked your interest in writing about it? And what's the story and themes that you wanted to tell in this work?
It's one of those photos from 1895. When this disaster happened in Paris, lots of people rushed to the scene with their cameras. Photography was a big thing for amateurs as well as professionals. And they took photos in the aftermath and for the next few days. And I saw one of those photos online, and it's an image of such incongruity and surrealism almost, in that it's a high-speed, modern, impressive steam train, but plunging vertically out a window. So I just thought I have to know what happened and find the story behind it and write a novel about it. And in a way, I had a huge number of facts to draw on because there were 40 newspaper articles printed about that disaster. And France is a very bureaucratic country, so I was able to look up, the detailed life records of the four-man crew and some of the passengers. But of course, a lot of it was also completely unknown. So that's ideal to me as a historical fiction writer. Lots of research, but then huge swathes of making it up. So I put a lot of real people on that train in my novel, but many of them, we have no idea whether they were ever on that train. But I invited them on because they could have been. So this novel exists in that could have been space.
I love that.
Well, I love that. And, speaking of that, I'm fascinated that you used real people in history who were or may have been on the train to populate this novel as your characters. And, we're not just talking about big name people. You're not saying celebrities of the day that you found that may or may not have been on the train. These were ordinary, everyday people. And there were at least a dozen of them who were actually recorded as being on the train when it derailed. So what made you do that? Like actually find these real people from history, as opposed to saying, I'm going to make up this person based loosely on the real people who really existed. What made you decide to find real people to base this on?
I just find the kind of grit of fact frequently turns into the pearl of good fiction. And for instance, the real people on the train, we've got a bullet maker called Gévelot who was traveling with his wife and her friend. And he told the journalists that when he felt the train was about to crash, he said to them, ladies, lift up your legs or the carriages are going to telescope and your legs will be cut off at the knee. So, that's a wonderful little detail.
Yes.
And that's the kind of thing that you find in real sources. So then when I needed to fill the other carriages, as it were, I needed dozens more people. I thought, 1890s Paris was a fascinating magnet city. It was like the New York of its day. And people were drawn to it for political freedom, for sexual freedom, for freedom of fashion. They were artists, painters, inventors. It was just a hub of the world. And so I will find more interesting characters by looking who was really around than I will by just sort of making them up. I'm kind of humble that way. I find better things in the sources than I could possibly invent.
Well, I love that. And I'm wondering what you did to bring them alive and kind of flesh them out on the page beyond, the newspaper articles, I think, are such a wonderful resource, and how wonderful to be able to draw real statements from those and bring them into the book. What did you do kind of for the rest of it, though? Because it was one of those books where there were so many characters, but they all felt so distinct and so real. And I really felt like I was sort of watching this documentary about how this actually unfolded. It was incredible. How did you go about fleshing each of them out?
Well, I guess I did things like look up, fashions of the 1890s. And I came across, a lot of people wore birds. A lot of women wore birds to decorate their hats or as jewelry. And there was a big campaign against it, like, this is cruel, ban the bird trade, which I thought was so like some of the dilemmas we have today about things to boycott or things to ban. Right now in Canada, a lot of us are buying Canadian because of the trade war, unprovoked, attacking our economy. So, I thought, a Save the Birds campaign will be a good moment. So I decided to give one of the characters earrings that were hummingbird heads. Or let's see, I knew I wanted a couple of pets on the train. I thought, who's brought their pets along? So we'll have a girl with a little lap dog. But then I wanted something more unusual. So I found that, one of the fashionable pets in those days was a monkey. So I had a character she's simply called Anna. She's a real person who turns up in Gauguin's paintings because she was his model. And she was really a trafficked teenager from somewhere in Asia. We don't know where. And I thought, if I'm imagining that she's on my train and it's a few years after she famously got away from Gauguin and sold all his furniture while he was out of town. I love it. So we've got this sort of resentful girl boss figure. And I thought, okay, she's going to be wearing a monkey around her neck. She's going to be like, you think I look exotic? You think, she's a racialized woman in 1890s Paris. And she's, if you're giving me funny looks, well, I'm going to wear a monkey, So I trawl very widely for details and then I decide who to give them to. Yeah.
I love it. Well, it really worked. They really very fully came alive on the page.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
That's one of the beauties of the book is these characters do come to life for us as the reader. We I almost want to hear the story about every one of their lives and how they got to be there too. So there's your next idea for a book.
But of course,
But
I had to throw most of it away. I mean, you know this,
course.
you
yes,
know,
yeah,
we do the research, and then the stuff that reads like research, we have to trim away. And in particular with this novel, I thought I cannot afford to let it get baggy because it's set on an express train. It's
Yep.
got to have the virtues of a train. It's got to, set off at 8:30 in the morning and finish at 4 o'clock, and we cannot afford too much baggage. So kind of
You're right.
ruthless narrative momentum.
The pacing
the
absolutely
pacing is
drove the story. Yeah, absolutely.
great. Oh my God. Okay, so one of the other not tricks, but one of the other things that really stood out for me was the Engine 21 served as an omniscient narrator of the story, almost like a Greek chorus. What led you to take that angle on? And can you talk about inserting it into the story as you went along?
Sure. I was salvaging something that didn't work. You know this, Kristin. This is what we do. I've always wanted to write a Dickensian novel with a wise, omniscient narrator narrating the entire thing from a sort of lofty eminence. I enjoy relaxing into novels like that. But I've never managed to, because anytime I've tried telling my story from some kind of godlike point of view, I don't believe in my sort of authority to speak that much. I find myself going, well, no, he would see that differently from her, you know? So it always breaks down into a number of different individual point of view sections instead. But I was left with some thoughts that it seemed like only someone who was above all the action would have. And I finally thought, it's the train. It's the train who's thinking things about trains and the journey and momentum, and the train might well know what's going to happen, and the train might well be able to kind of sense the thoughts of the people traveling through her. So finally I just relaxed into it and said, okay, I will let the train speak.
I love it. It was such a cool touch. Speaking of the train, I meant to mention earlier the photograph that you mentioned of the train derailment actually is in the back of your book, right? So for anybody to read it,
Yes.
or anyone who picks it up to read will be able to see that for themselves, which I think is important.
It's funny. With my very first historical novel, I was a little bit sheepish about the fact that it was based on fact. I was thinking, well, only people like me doing a PhD in English literature of the 18th century will care. This is really geeky stuff, And my editor at the time, Lenny Goodings at Virago, she was like, are you kidding? Everybody wants the facts. We love a little bit of nonfiction in our fiction. So please beef up that note. Tell us more. And I was like, really? Okay. But yes, I found readers are hungry for more. And a lovely thing, Kristin, is that sometimes other writers come across a true story in, say, a short story I've written, and they go off and write a play or a screenplay about it. And I've borrowed from academics, like the footnotes of their works. I've found things that are the subject of fiction for me. So I love being very transparent about my sources and making it clear what I've made up, partly because it satisfies the readers and partly because it sparks other people's research, and it all becomes this wonderful kind of, chain letter of history.
I completely agree with you. As someone who writes history too, I always feel like the author's note is one of the most important parts of the book. And as someone who reads historical fiction, I love reading the author's note because it helps you to understand, where the story came from and, what parts were solidly based in fact. And sometimes as a novelist, you have to take small liberties. And I think you owe it to the reader to explain that in the author's note too. So I think that's very helpful, as well as directing people toward nonfiction sources where they can find out more,
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of the author's note, you describe the Montparnasse district of Paris as a place where every wall bears some thumbprint of the past, which I love that quote. What was it like for you to spend a year immersed in a place like that writing this book? And beyond that, how do you think your time there affected you as a writer beyond just the way that it touched this specific book?
Oh, it was the ideal experience. I didn't go there for a 1-year research trip, right? That would be too much. We were going there anyway. I was going there with my family because my partner is a professor of French. So we go there on her sabbaticals and we immerse our kids in French. They get more bilingual and I just eat more pastries.
That sounds fantastic.
It was great for the novel because, like in Paris, they when they name a street after somebody, they actually put a little historical note on the plaque. So every street will have, in capitals, some obscure name, and then just below it'll tell you exactly what they're famous for. So they're very good at keeping their history alive. It's never erased. And often there'll be some weird little element left in a wall. Like near me, there was a strange little shape in the outside wall of a building. And when I looked it up and went on a sort of Open Doors Day, architecturally, they have these days once a year. I found that this was a hatch where they used to leave babies so that the nuns could look after them, an anonymous hatch, which they still have in some cities today. So
Wow.
that kind of trace on the walls is so helpful. Some of the experiences I had are kind of, tourist commodified, like, visiting the catacombs, and some are utterly obscure. And some were just a matter of me wondering, like, okay, if the train driver lived 1 kilometer from the tracks, could his wife hear the train going by? So sometimes you just have to walk around and sort of do your detective work. I would say more generally, a year in Paris was just great for me because of the sheer stimulus of people from all over the world. It's a wonderfully buzzy, multicultural city. And luckily, for my purposes, it was like that in the 1890s too. I didn't have to try and diversify my cast. My cast was already composed of expats, like, say, you've got Henry Ossawa Tanner, an African-American painter who settled in Paris, in France, because it was less racist than back home. And you've got, a North African coffee seller. You've got students from Cambodia. France being an empire and being Paris being this sort of hub of technology and invention and science and the arts and sort of queer freedom and women's freedom, it just attracted people. So I was spoiled for choice when it came to choosing interesting people to put on my train.
Well, you certainly chose interesting ones. Absolutely.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm getting these little goosebumps too, revisiting them, because they were just so beautifully created and told. I loved it. So one of the things that has been said about you is that, like the best teachers, you pack a great deal of knowledge in your work without the reader ever getting bored. And that truly is evident in this book. I learned so many historical details about class, everyday life, and more from the time period in your story. How did you approach getting these details just right? And I'm talking about things like the clock setting differences and the fortified water with rusty nails in the cup. Oh my God.
People still nowadays, they buy a little iron object to pop in their cooking pot as a way of getting their iron up. And yes, I suppose I do what people often call deep dives. I Google a subject and read it for 3 days. But the crucial thing is to be willing to then set aside all that research if there's no place for it in the book. And the way I know if there's a place for it in the book is, would one of my point of view characters care enough about this to think about it? So, for instance, I didn't want to put in sort of generalized ranting about the ills of society. What I wanted were characters who cared deeply about this stuff. So, I've got a couple of arguments in there between this young, angry anarchist girl, Madeleine Pelletier, and this older kind of charity social worker, Russian, called Blonska. And they both were real people who cared passionately about the poor, but had very different points of view on how you could improve things and whether you could. So in a way, by letting them have an argument about it, I've got really good reasons to bring forward all that material about poverty and injustice. Whereas if I just sort of pasted it on, then the reader would feel lectured.
That's a good point.
That's a very good point. So what the other thing about the setting and you're really, this is one of the things that I think you're kind of well known for, is that you're the master of the microcosm. So many of your work features constrained spaces. What draws you to telling your stories from that vantage point?
I know, I sometimes wonder what's wrong with me, because of course I'm the captor. I became so aware of this when I was writing Room, which is about a boy growing up in a locked room. I was making all the same decisions as their, psychopathic captor. I was sort of shopping for them hypothetically on IKEA.com. I was deciding how many books they'd have, a total of 10, which, you must admit 10 is torture. So I'm the one choosing to keep them stuck there. And in the case of my train, they're only stuck for a matter of hours. Trains in those days, it wasn't like in sort of films and novels from the 1930s on, that a train is a space you move through. So people chase and follow each other and wander and pursue and hide. In the 1890s, there was nowhere to go. There were no corridors, no dining cars, no toilets. So you were pretty much stuck in your carriage until it got to the next station. And then you all got to leap off for 5 minutes and try and see to your needs as fast as possible. So yeah, train is really in those days a series of shut rooms. And I don't think I'm a psychopath, but, as an author, I must admit, I just find it, first of all, it's an easier situation for me because they can't go anywhere. So I get to really get to know that space and every object they would have with them and how much space they have. But in particular, things get tense between my characters because they don't have enough room. So it turns up the temperature of interaction, whether it be flirtation or resentment or somebody elbowing your ribs, or tensions about space. It just makes all the little particles speed up in my experience. So it's mostly a literary thing. But then sometimes I also think it's because I'm very interested in the history of women, and women's lives have mostly been too small. I'm just generalizing here, but wandering too far and free has not usually been our problem. Stuck at home or made to stay out of the public realm is a classic trope of women's history.
Oh gosh, what a fascinating insight into the way you think about putting these books together. I love it.
Yes.
We mentioned this in your bio when we introduced you, and we were also talking a little bit briefly about this backstage. But you have all sorts of forms of creative expression. You write novels, you write short stories, you write plays, you write young adult, you write films, which is incredible. And like I said backstage, I need to pick your brain a little bit more about that. But do you have a favorite outlet for your work, or how do you decide in what format you're going to tell a story? Is it dictated by what the story is, or how you want? I don't know. I'm curious how you choose.
Yeah. It is dictated by the idea I get. Yeah, because certain ideas seem to call for certain forms. Each form has its own strengths. So just to generalize wildly, the novel is really good for long analysis of things and long conversations, conversations in which you can be fairly subtle because you can just kind of sprinkle things in. Whereas if that's a movie, that's going to get cut down to 3 lines of character, 3 lines of dialogue. Films, on the other hand, are amazing for, say, visual realism. You can absolutely believe you are there in a way that it does have to work for you, whereas the reader of a book has to do it for themselves. But then plays are amazing for making the audience feel that they are actually sort of contributing, that the thing is happening right in front of them. They are watching it happen. So there's this feeling of emotional involvement. And also plays are great at the kind of magic trick of like, I know this is not real. I can see the edge of the screen. I can see the lights. And yet I choose to believe it. So they make for a very active audience. So I guess I try and think what form will work best. But then I'm also aware that, they have different, there are different experiences for me. I would say the most enjoyable experience is probably doing a play because it's social, like making a movie, but nobody's off in their trailer being famous, right? With a play, you're like all there in the same room. There's a real kind of democratic vibe to it. And you're all there at the same time. Again, a movie, you might find that the star has filmed their bit and gone on to the next shoot before you get there. Whereas with the play, you're all together in one room. However, then in terms of the kind of lingering effect of that work, my books, in my experience, I feel I get to choose all the words, right? So I have the most autonomy or power within that. And then they have a lot of time to find their readers. A play is over so soon. And even a film may not be in cinemas for long or even at all, but a book goes out there in the world and finds its readers. So if for some reason someone held a gun to my head and said, pick one literary form and stick to it, I would choose the novel.
Oh, interesting. I was going to ask. Okay.
Yeah. If I had to. But, I don't know why I'm torturing myself with that possibility.
No one's going to hold a gun to your head.
No one's holding a gun. No. Okay, so I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, but how do you decide what voice you're going to tell it in? Because you're certainly not a one-trick pony. You have all these different angles of things that you've written and created, but so how do you choose who's telling your story?
Yeah, I think choosing point of view is probably the most important decision. And I often really wrestle with that one because as soon as you decide on your camera angle, as it were, the story shifts. I mean, different things will be noticed and told by different points of view. So one thing I really enjoy in the Paris Express is that I don't replay large chunks of the action from different points of view, but I have people noticing each other. So, by the time we meet the central character, Madame Pelletier, and she's talking about what she's there on the train to do, we've already seen her glimpsed through the eyes of others. We know that the guard considers her one of those like young, androgynously dressed women from Paris, who he sees as kind of troublemakers. She's been glimpsed and wondered about by other people. So I love I love that, that alternation in point of view. But some of my novels I've done from just one point of view, if that was what I wanted, absolute immersion. Say The Wonder, which I did as a novel and then as a film, the Florence Pugh character of the nurse, I wanted everything from her point of view because there are a lot of secrets that she's been shut out from. It's a sort of detective puzzle. So I wanted to be locked in her head trying to work it out. It would have been sort of cheating if I'd skipped into the minds of others and told you more. With the Paris Express, I knew this was going to be an ensemble piece because the train brings together lots of different people, and that's the whole point of it. It's not a private car. So I knew I'd have lots of narrators, but the question was which ones. And I didn't always know that in advance because some characters I brought into my book and I wrote quite a few scenes from their points of view. And then I thought, no, you're not the right passenger for this train because you may be a fascinating character with a great backstory or famous, but if you're not having an interesting day on the 22nd of October, 1895 on this train, then you don't contribute. So I did a bit of pushing people off the train, metaphorically. And even within the question of which characters I'd have on there, and the point of view characters were probably the ones whose secret thoughts I wanted to reveal. Because if a character is very chatty and reveals themselves fine through dialogue, you don't need to write point of view sections from their perspective as much. But if someone has secrets or private thoughts, or say, I've got one 7-year-old boy on there, he doesn't say much, but he's noticing everything. So as a noticer, he earned himself a slot.
I love that. He was actually one of my favorite characters. I thought he was great. I'd love to talk a little bit more about Room for a minute. So first off, that book was a massive success. It was a huge bestseller that met with rave reviews. It was longlisted for the Orange Prize. It was shortlisted for the Booker. And it seemed like there was a period in time where I feel like every book club was reading it. And of course, the movie was a critical and commercial success, receiving 4 Oscar nominations, including for Best Picture. And of course, Brie Larson won for Best Actress. That must have been a whirlwind for you. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how did it shift the trajectory of your career in any way?
No, it got me a lot more readers, but I was doing my thing anyway. I've been lucky enough to have never had a real job, right? So I've been writing and publishing my novels from my early 20s. So then at 40, I sold Room and suddenly everything got a bit more big budget and more readers, but it didn't fundamentally shift anything because I was 7 novels in. So I wasn't going to suddenly try and chase the market by doing something more commercial. Also, I feel publishers and authors, we often do not know what's going to sell well. Plenty of big mistakes out there. So I find it very comforting that we can't tell what will succeed in different ways. So just do what truly interests you. So, no, I'd say maybe I'm a little bit more plot focused since Room because I found it was such a pleasure to have people respond so strongly to the suspense elements. I mean, it's not a thriller, but it's got these suspense elements. So I remember somebody, a reader texting me to say, I'm sitting in the parking lot outside work and I need to go to my shift, but I need to know what happens to the boy. So that was a real pleasure. So I've probably been a little bit plottier since, but not very much because the kind of books I do are one-offs. They're all peculiar and they're all different in some way. And I try and really adapt my toolkit to whatever the particular story I'm trying to tell requires.
Do you think you're more conscious of thinking of the way you are thinking of plotting in a filmic way? Like are you thinking more than you were in your early career about the different formats that a single story could appear in or could occupy?
No, I think it's more that having got a lot more readers for Room, I'm a bit more maybe open to those kind of genre elements of fiction. But no, it's not specifically about films because I never assume any of my books will become films. There've been only 2 so far out of many different film projects I've been involved in developing. So, I think of your typical film as not making it all the way to the big screen.
That would be my experience.
Indeed. Yes, you know what I'm talking about. So it would be absurd to write a novel as a way of writing a film. And it would be very slow and indirect thing to do, to write all those words and then throw most of them away. So no. I in a way I would say films have just given me a bit more practice at the kind of, the tough decisions, that's not working, or that chapter is boring, let's just cut it out. But I was probably quite a cutter anyway. I've always written easily. I write a lot, and so I really don't mind throwing away a lot of words as well. In a way, what I would say I've developed since Room the film is just an appreciation for the strengths inherent to each of these genres. So when I write a film, I'm hyper aware that the audience are just choosing to sit down for maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. That's all the time you have. Don't waste their time. And that they have certain expectations of the plot's movement based on all the other films they've seen. So there are really strong genre conventions about that. And with a play, I'm really aware that, again, the time is limited, but that the audience is far more able to kind of hold two truths in their mind at once, like this is all a pretend, and yet this is all we choose to believe. And with novels, I come back to novels over and over, so grateful for how relaxed the time is. Even with a novel like The Paris Express, which is very sort of propulsive because I'm trying to match a train journey. But even there's time for these long conversations about everything that you could not get in a film or dramatic adaptation. Sure. The plot can meander. It can find its way there. And so you can be subtle. You can drop in just tiny little hints, which will later on pay off. So I absolutely love novels, and I love their psychological quality, the way they can just sit in somebody's mind, even if that somebody is not saying a thing. So no, I especially having been able to turn a few of my books into film, novel, and play, like with Room, I just feel it's been like a kind of a masterclass for me in what each of those genres offers, rather than like, oh, look what I can do in 3 forms. It's much more like, look what theater can do, look what film can do.
That's incredible.
Just keep talking all day. I'm going to sit here and listen. This is awesome. So I'd like to manifest out into the universe that I would love to see the Paris Express on the stage or on film. It just lends itself to that. And I thought about those things as I was reading it. It's like, I'd like to see this. I'd like to see that. So let's hope that something big comes out of this.
That would be lovely. Even though I don't ever write a novel in order to make a film, I love the adaptation process. I always get involved myself because I think it's great fun to, in the style of my kids playing Lego, take it all apart and try another version. And see what of the story is essential and what is variable. It's just enormous fun as a process. And of course, you have collaborators. That's another really fun thing. You see what can change in a wonderful way when you add in other people.
Yeah.
Yep. I think collaboration makes a project a lot more rich. Okay, Emma.
It's a more social experience too, because writing can be quite isolated at home alone.
Solitary,
yeah.
Okay, so Emma, if you stick around, we have more to talk to you about. But first, we have a few quick reminders for our listeners and viewers out there.
So for all of you watching and listening, we encourage you to rush out and buy your copy of The Paris Express. The perfect place to do that is in our Friends and Fiction shop on bookshop.org. You'll not only be getting it at a discount, but all your purchases there support our show, our guests, and indie booksellers nationwide. And again, as we mentioned, there's that great picture of the train, and there's this wonderful author's note in the back. Yeah. So if you're intrigued by what we talked about today, I feel like that's the perfect place. You need to have that book to hold in your hand to see all of that in the back.
Absolutely. And don't forget to visit friendsandfiction.com for details on our show schedule, upcoming in-person events, and links to the award-winning Friends and Fiction official book club with Brendan and Lisa, our merch store, and our Substack newsletter sign-up.
And speaking of Substack, you can read all our free weekly posts on the Substack website or app, or subscribe for free to get them directly in your inbox. And if you upgrade to our paid Substack, which costs just $5 a month, you will have access to deeper dives with all of our weekly show guests, plus monthly roundtable discussions like the amazing one we just did on writing tips, and the one we have coming up about rom-coms, plus bonus Q&As with additional authors. If you enjoy tuning in for our weekly author interviews, this is a big way you can support us for basically the cost of a single cup of coffee each month, or to break it down even further, just over $1 every week. So check us out at friendsandfiction.substack.com.
Yeah. So Emma, back to you. As we begin to wind down this chat, we've read that you're working on the film adaptation of H is for Hawk. Can you tell us anything about that and what other projects you might have in store for us?
Oh, that one's been such a treat. That's one of these projects that just came at me with no warning. I mean, I generate a lot of my projects, but sometimes people just come to me with a great idea. So I had somehow not heard about Helen MacDonald's astonishing sort of genre blending memoir about
Amazing.
grief
Yes.
and falconry. And I was asked to adapt it for film, and they sent it to me, and I read it, and I was like, yes. I knew it wouldn't be easy because fans of the book will know that it's not a simple story. It's in a way a book of nature writing, of sort of cultural history, of painful memoir, and of technical wizardry, all about the care and feeding and hunting of falcons. So I thought, whoa, how will I find a clear through line here? But I really loved the challenge, and seeing how much of the tone of Helen's kind of intellectual inquiry I'd be able to put in a well-shaped, satisfying story about a woman grieving the loss of her father. So when I got to visit the set in Wales just before Christmas, I was just blown away. Partly the sheer beauty of the sort of outdoor falconry sections, but also the acting. Claire Foy is playing Helen MacDonald, and anyone who's loved her work on, say, The Crown or All of Us Strangers recently, or her work in theatre, will know she's just a matchless actress. I couldn't be happier with how the project has come to fruition. And it's not, your typical kind of, big budget crowd pleasing type film. It's psychologically deep and funny. The family dynamics in particular was just such a joy, watching the mother and brother and sister negotiate all the kind of, awkward moments of a bereavement. And we have a number of very talented birds playing Mabel, and it's an absolutely beautiful film. I just can't wait to see it on the big screen.
Oh, how wonderful. I'm excited about it too. Is it, do you find it easier to adapt someone else's work than your own? Because you don't have to take as big of a step back almost to see it in a new way?
That's a good question. I think the first draft is easier than the first draft of your own. Yeah, because the first draft of your own, you really have to say to yourself, like, shed any notion that you are taking each page of your deathless prose and somehow putting it on the screen. You're really not. Yep. And in fact, you probably better just to keep your book shut and just say, what do I remember of the story? And now I'm going to tell it all over again. So with somebody else's book, you could, the initial sort of wielding of the scalpel, you can do more easily. But then the process of getting from one draft to the next, I would say, is the same for both, because wherever you began, the same questions come up about, the audience. What do they know? What do they care about? How much time we spend on each thing, how the plot is to move, how much time we can afford to take for kind of, extras rather than everything that's absolutely, fitting into the main through line. So yeah, it's no easier, but it's certainly fascinating. I as a learning exercise for myself, being able to get inside somebody else's book and sort of check out its structure and work out how it does its magic. It's hugely educational for me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. Okay, so Emma, before we let you go, where else can we catch you on the road next week, and how can we follow you online?
Yeah, I'm on a US 15-city tour with Summit Books, and the entire schedule is on my Instagram, or also on Summit Books' Instagram, and it's on my Facebook fan page as well. So I'm really hoping to meet a lot of readers on this one. It's a wonderful tour to mostly independent bookstores and some speaker series, and it takes me into many states I've never been to before, like Idaho and Oklahoma. So it's not the usual just bi-coastal tour. It really is all over the US. And this is a fascinating time to visit the US at a time of such dramatic change, so this is going to be a fascinating tour for me, quite apart from anyone I meet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I'd love to pick your brain after that tour, what you learned and what you saw, and what your impressions are of it all. So Emma, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I think we've gotten so many nuggets of great gem knowledge from you, and it's just fascinating to talk to you. It's just a huge pleasure. Thanks for being on the Friends in Fiction show.
The pleasure was all mine. Kristin and Ron, thank you so much.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Emma. We loved having you. For all of you out there, be sure to tune in next week when Patti and Kristy will be welcoming Amelia Hart to discuss her new novel, The Sirens. That show will air live on the Friends in Fiction Facebook page and YouTube channel on Wednesday, March 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And it'll be published to our podcast for your listening pleasure on Friday, March 28th. And I also want to remind you that this week, Patti Callahan Henry's new book is brand new. It just came out 2 days ago or yesterday. It came out March 18th.
Yesterday. Yes.
And that is The Story She Left Behind. And you can find that in bookstores across the country too.
Another stunner. But okay, thank you all for being with us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in. You can join us every week on Facebook or YouTube, where our live show airs on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Instagram. We're so glad you're here.